Hello class, this is Professor Satterwhite and I am here to talk to you about zines and also talk to you about punk culture. So first off, let me tell you where I'm talking to you from. I'm talking to you from the headquarters of the 309 Punk Project. Some of you may have seen the Punxsutawney exhibit at the T.T. Wentworth Museum, State History Museum downtown. If not, if it's still around when you're watching this, check it out. But otherwise, this is connected with that exhibit. And the exhibit itself talks about punk history in Pensacola, and a lot of that history happened here in this house where I'm sitting on the front porch of right now. So I wanted to do that, but I also want to walk over here. And let me also mention that I'm talking to you from the city downtown, of course, so you're going to hear some cars occasionally. You might hear some people out there with their dogs. And also, I don't have a lighting crew, so you'll have to deal with the shade. I tried to figure that stuff out early, and it didn't quite work out. But anyway, I'm walking around right here and I wanted to show you this place right here. So this house right here is right next to 309. As you can guess, it's 311. The house just a couple, one house up. And I mentioned this, I'm not going to sit here on the porch, and I mentioned this because this is where the author of Spirit of St. Louis lived when he, not when he wrote this, but this is where he lived when he lived here in Pensacola. And I wanted to do this, and the similar reason I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Fitzgerald when we were over at the Fitzgerald house, and we were looking at some of the videos from there. To see the authors and the places where they write, where they put together works, where they create. Because if we don't see authors in the context of average, everyday people who are doing the work that they do best, which is writing, then we look at we see literature as something that is coming from another realm. And I think that's important because what zines do, and one of the important aspects of zines is that they democratize the idea of literature. And this is really what self-publishing does. It democratizes the idea of literature and what literature is. When we start off the class, usually we have a little discussion about what is literature. And when we think of literature, and I'm saying this literature with a capital L, that it has a very broad definition, and it could change from person to person. That if you want to think of some of the major works of literature in America, we could say Moby Dick, or we could look at Huckleberry Finn, or many, many other texts that have been written over the years. Invisible Man, For Whom the Bell Tolls, etc., etc. So these are just a couple of the works we can think of as literature. However, there's many, many, many other works that we could also see. And the reason that we don't often see them is just because of the dominance of various voices and also publishing houses, publishers, and for a myriad reasons why we don't see everything as literature, or we don't have this idea of what is literature narrowed down, is because it's complicated. A lot of these works are very complicated, and they're complicated to pin down. And zines fall into that category too. Now, in saying that too, I don't want to say that everything that's written should be considered literature, although you can make that argument, but it may be a little too broad. That generally should have some parameters, but I'm not going to give you the parameters because I want you in some ways to be able to think of this on your own and be able to work out these larger conversations on your own. But I will post a few articles that talk about this specifically. So let's talk about zines, okay? And talk about where they fit into this. So zines are, by definition, a work of self-published material that is written usually by one or two people, usually not more than that, but sometimes there are exceptions. They often have very small print runs, sometimes as high as 100. That would be an average, maybe 50 to 100 for most zines. Some can have print runs much smaller than that, depending on who they think the audience is, and some can have much bigger print runs than that, like Cometbus, for instance, which I believe publishes in the tens of thousands, at least 10,000, something like that. And it depends on who they're getting this out to and how they can get this out. One of the reasons they have smaller print runs is because of the distribution, because they are distributed in different channels than normal books are in the way that you'd see them over at Books A Million or Barnes & Noble. It's different in that way. So because of that, then there's no reason to get 10,000, 20, 30,000 copies of a zine if you have no idea how you're going to distribute them. So that might be one of the reasons for that. But there's lots of other reasons too, because maybe your audience is much smaller, and maybe it's more a niche, and maybe it's more of a group of people versus a group of people, maybe very specific people that you're writing towards versus a larger group. So let's talk about the history of zines. So zines to different people, zines can be seen as going back as far as the pamphlets of the 1600s, 1600s, and some of the early publications where people were starting to make arguments back and forth, fiery arguments, whether it's against monarchies, you think of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, or even religious pamphlets for some, might fall into some of these categories. Personally, I don't buy that as much. I think that the idea that political pamphlets or zines is a little problematic, because in that way that they fit into a little bit of the category, and I can see why people would make that connection, but I think it makes it a little too broad as far as zines go. And zines should be seen as just a little bit different than just a political rant, which they're not. That said, zines can be political rants. So just like with the definition of literature can be very fluid, definitely the definition of what is a zine can also be pretty fluid. What I usually tell people is that when you understand zines, when you get to know about the zines and you get to see more of the culture, then you have not only a better understanding of what they are, but then you can recognize them when you see them. But again, it's harder to put down the definition. So I have a couple zines that I wanted to show you. First off, I should say, this is not a zine, or this probably wouldn't be considered a zine, but this is one that you may have seen before, may have showed you in another video. This is Fire. This was written by some members of the Harlem Renaissance. Probably the most famous one is one of your Floridian writers, so your Florida writers, fellow Floridians, if you're living here in Florida. And if you're not, then it's one of the writers that you likely read while you were in high school, possibly Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston is one of the most famous American writers in our history, and sadly didn't get the recognition as much while she was alive. Different points in her life she did, different times not, but like a lot of writers, she definitely did not die rich. And we know of her now because of the work of another writer, Alice Walker, who ended up finding, literally going out and finding her grave, and then bringing her story back. But one of her first early publications, where she helped with, was in this magazine called Fire. I would consider this more of a journal, an art journal, and that's what they consider this as. But there's ways that you can see this. This is ways you can see this within the history of zines. So in saying that, why I would make that argument is because it's self-published. There's a strong, youthful vibe to it for sure, and there's also a large collection of pretty diverse folks that are putting their work together in here, which again fits into the category of many journals, but also this has the quality of a zine, and that is self-published. It's self-published, and self-published with the idea that I don't care what other people think. What I'm doing right now, what we're doing right now is important, and hopefully you'll pay attention. And if not, then we know that this is important, and we're going to do this anyway, and hope the world recognizes it. Sadly for them, the world didn't quite recognize it at this point. It was trashed by a lot of literary critics at that time, but now is an incredibly sought-after publication. This one here is one that I found in a small bookstore over in Asheville, North Carolina, and I was really, really happy to find a copy of it. So I wanted to show you that. So that's from the 1920s. And then we have this one here, and this is a underground newspaper, which kind of fits into that same category too. Thinking going from the 1920s, then we have this, and we have the rise of smaller zines that came out of early science fiction writing in the 1930s. But then we also have the underground press in the 1960s. And with the underground press, this was a critique of the mainstream media, and also was younger people deciding to write for themselves. They were disturbed at the way that the media was presenting their movements of the 1960s, the countercultural movements. They felt they didn't disagree, they couldn't have a voice, and felt that the older generations weren't paying enough attention to them. So what did they do? They started their own publication. they started their own publications, many of them. In 1965, there were 5. By the 1970, there were over 1,000, including here in Pensacola. In fact, ironically, only a couple blocks up from here, there was Pensacola's contribution to the underground press. What's in there as well, a small little magazine called the Fish Cheer, or a newspaper called the Fish Cheer. But they're still a little bit different than zines. But still, it has a bit of the same quality that Fire and this has, is that it's written by the youth, and not necessarily totally for the youth, but written for the counterculture, which often is seen as a youth culture, but not entirely. But then we get in the 1970s with the rise of punk rock. I'm wearing a shirt from the Punk Museum over in Los Angeles. And the person on the cover is a guy named Sid Vicious. On my shirt is Sid Vicious. And that's emblematic of the era from which that generation of punk, and where we see a lot of the early zines that can be seen as zines in the modern context, come from. The biggest difference between publications like this and publications like this are really in the means of production, and why zines came out in the punk scene is because of a couple of different advents. And one of the biggest inventions that happened in that period was the invention of the Xerox machine. Having a Xerox machine, a photocopier machine, allowed for people to, instead of sending this off to a printer and having thousands of copies of this printed off, then I could go to any copy shop and just for dimes or maybe a couple dollars be able to print a magazine myself. And that was unheard of prior to that. So to do this previously, you would have to get numerous copies, thousands of copies of this, to be able to have your magazine put out there, have your works put out there, and have your words read, or you'd have to go to another publication and hopefully they would publish you, which is another gatekeeper. What the invention of the photocopy machine did was it allowed for people to become their own gatekeepers. They could open up the doors to their worlds. They can open up the doors to what their thoughts were, and they can open up the doors for other people too. So a lot of zines, they published other people's works. They did interviews. They focused on their bands. And similar to the underground press in the 1960s, one of the reasons why they came out was because, as I mentioned, that there weren't a lot of other people that were paying attention to what they were doing and thought that what they were doing was trivial, stupid, and that their youthful energy was very misspent. Well, nowadays we look at that time as a very important time in American history, where a lot of things were taking place in the 1960s and 70s. And within music and within the subculture, that what was happening in the 1970s was also very important for the development of the culture itself. American culture, English culture, but definitely in American culture, and how punk became a big part of this was really from the roots of the 1960s counterculture. I'm not going to go into that anymore, though, but just wanted to mention that. With the advent of the copy machine, the photocopy machine, then that allowed for people to go to a photocopy machine and then print their own newspapers, their own magazines. And as they were doing this, then we have, again, what I call the democratization of the media. So this allows for anybody to write. This allows for anybody to be the author, and also allows for people to focus on the works of their friends. So if the New York Times isn't going to pay attention to certain bands, or if the New York Times isn't going to pay attention to different movements, the Pensacola News Journal isn't going to focus on some of the bigger punk bands that are happening here. Magazines like Rolling Stone aren't going to focus on some of these works. Then why don't we just do it ourselves? So it's that this do-it-yourself DIY ethic is very foundational to the idea of zines and the publication of zines. So I have a couple others. One other zine I wanted to show you. This is a zine named Doris. This is also at one point written over here at this house. And the author of this, Cindy Crabb, is pretty well known. She does a lot of work in zines in particular, but also does a lot of other activism. She uses her platform that's been built over the years to help other writers get their words out and focus people within the counterculture, within the punk counterculture, into different directions, as far as everything from issues with addiction, recovery, but also issues of consent and other things that are really important. And she did so initially through her zine. If you get a copy of her zine, which is available in Pensacola sometimes, but it's also available in other places, if you go to these small independent bookstores, or you can go to her website too. She has a website, and it's dorisdoris.com. Three Doors. It's dorisdoris.com. You can also check out some of her zines and get some yourself if you're interested. But she was very inspirational to a lot of writers because she was able to write from a personal perspective, and in the personal perspective, telling the world, the readers out there in the world who was watching, that our personal stories are important, our own ideas are important, and should be, and there's an audience for these. There's an audience for our own stories. So if you think that your story is unique and you think your story that nobody understands you, nobody hears you, then zines might be a place for you, because what zines do is they allow for you to be able to tell your stories. And I promise you, for whatever your stories are, that there's other people out there that are interested. And a lot of what Cindy was writing about early on was seen as, to some people, might be seen as a little controversial and different than what a lot of other zines were doing. But nonetheless, the trajectory of the zines have certainly followed her and followed the work that she's doing. So it would be wrong to say that she wasn't influential in that. In fact, be totally incorrect doing that. But one of the other writers who was also influential in this part was our friend Aaron Cometbus. Aaron Cometbus started this zine in 1981 when he was 14 years old. And this is the one that we're reading in class right now. The Spirit of St. Louis is number 52, but he's since done several since then. He has a new one out right now, and depends on when you're watching this video, but might be a newer one coming out later. But he's been doing this for several years, and it's changed over the years in a lot of different ways. But the idea and the message and stuff has largely stayed the same. The focus is on punk. The focus is on punk and punk culture, and writing about this as a legitimate culture, which goes back to our ideas of what zines are. So are zines literature in the way that we see literature? And I would argue that they are, because they follow a very specific tradition in American history. So first we have the history of self-publication, which I've talked about before, but I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So with self-publication, not only do we have the zines, or the pamphlets from the 1700s, and you think of Common Sense, Thomas Paine's famous pamphlet, Common Sense from the 1770s. But then we move forward and we look at other works. Some famous self-published works were Leaves of Grass, one of the most famous works of poetry in American literature, written by Walt Whitman. That he did this, and not only did it once, but did it several times. So it's published by other people now. Now you can buy it over Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble Publications out of copyright, of course. So there's lots of other ways that this is put out there. But its original publications were self-published. A lot of publications that came out in the early days of publishing in America were self-published works. And some of our most famous pieces, and poetry in particular, because poetry generally has a somewhat limited audience, that a lot of these works are also self-published. Allen Ginsberg's Howl is one of the most famous ones, but there's many, many others out there. Poetry chapbooks is what they call them, and they're close to zines. Again, not always exactly like that, and depends on the format, and depends on what the author's trying to do with it, and if they're of the culture, often. But still, they are close connection to zines, these small poetry magazines. But both Whitman and Ginsberg, with their self-publications, or small press publications in Ginsberg's case, are works that we can see, as connected to these movements. If you look at them, you look at their early works, then there's definitely a lot of similarities. But then also within the attitude, within the style, that people are writing about what they want to write about, say what they want to say. And there's a lot of other self-published works that are out there. And now, because we can do this online and we can create our own books online, that really anybody can be author. In fact, I've had several students over the years who have published their own books, and I'm super proud of all of them who have done that, published their own books, and I applaud them for that. But I also see the zines as one of those same areas, and a place where if you want to get your work out, that you can. So when we look at literature, again, I want you to think of this in the broadest context, because it has a lot of the characteristics of literature, zines too. It doesn't mean that all of them would generally fall into that category, but I also don't want you to have the prejudiced mindset that would only think of literature as being written by a certain group of people and look a certain way, published by certain authors, have the same complete laudatory reviews that literature you would think would have, whereas a lot of literature doesn't have that. And Cometbus, is definitely falls into these categories. Cometbus is loved by a lot of people. The zine is closely followed and it's been done for decades now, and because of that, then it's grown quite a large following. And this issue in particular is a standard novella. A novella is a smaller novel, and what it does is this follows a large group of people, a large group of punks who are living their lives through some pretty precarious situations, surviving. And we have the author starting off here in the book in the first couple pages, being dropped off and left kind of left behind, and then we see how he ends up developing community. I just want to show you this one picture here because I really like this picture. It's just an image of punk, image of youthful vigor, and I think the author might be in one of these pictures too. I'm not 100% sure, but I think he is. But at any rate, there's a lot of other books of literature out there that look similar to this too. Probably the best comparative work that you could see would maybe be that of John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck wrote a number of smaller works that deal with a large group of people. Tortilla Flat is one of the big ones. Cannery Row is another one. And if you were to see those in a similar context, folded, photocopied, and sent to you in the mail in a similar format as this would be, that you might not think of that as literature. However, we think of it as literature because of the author and who the author is. But it's similar in a lot of ways. So, and this text right here has a lot of those similarities too. So a lot of similarities between this work and some of those other works from those time periods, but also a lot of time periods that are coming up right now, like the one we're living in. So anyway, I wanted to tell you that. I wanted to talk to you about zines, and I wanted to do that specifically from the houses where some of these works were or at least not some of these works, but some of the people that had lived who created some of these works. All right, so that's where I am now. I'm signing off from this very historic punk area. Take care.